In the sterile corridors of St. Mary's Hospital, a story of love, sacrifice, and unexpected revelations unfolded, forever changing the lives of the Silva family. Ricardo Silva, a devoted father, had always believed that the bond between him and his son Pedro transcended mere genetics. As Pedro battled leukemia, Ricardo didn't hesitate to offer his bone marrow, hoping to save the child he had raised and loved for the past 8 years. The day of the transplant arrived, filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Ricardo, lying on the hospital bed, watched as the medical team prepared for the procedure. His wife, Maria, stood by his side, her eyes brimming with tears of gratitude and worry. They had been through so much since Pedro's diagnosis, and this felt like their last chance at a normal life. As the doctors began the process of harvesting Ricardo's bone marrow, a sense of optimism filled the room. The family had been told that a close genetic match would significantly increase Pedro's chances of recovery. Ricardo winced slightly as the needle entered his hip, but the discomfort was nothing compared to the pain of watching his son suffer through countless chemotherapy sessions. Hours passed, and the transplant was completed successfully. Pedro, weak but smiling, thanked his father from his hospital bed. The family allowed themselves to hope, to dream of a future where cancer was just a distant memory. But fate had other plans that would shake the very foundation of their family. 2 weeks after the transplant, Dr. Oliveira, the lead physician on Pedro's case, called Ricardo and Maria into her office. The couple entered, hand in hand, expecting an update on their son's recovery. Instead, they were met with a grave expression that instantly set their hearts racing. Mr. and Mrs. Silva, Dr. Oliveira began, her voice heavy with the weight of her words. "I'm afraid I have some unexpected news." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "The routine tests we conducted on the bone marrow revealed something unusual. The genetic markers indicate that Ricardo is not Pedro's biological father." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Maria's hand tightened around Ricardo's, her face a mask of confusion and disbelief. Ricardo, for his part, felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. "There must be some mistake," Maria insisted, her voice trembling. "We've raised Pedro since birth. How could this be possible?" Dr. Oliveira's expression softened with sympathy. "I assure you, we've run the tests multiple times to confirm. The results are conclusive. Given this information, we've had to halt the transplant process as the genetic mismatch could potentially harm Pedro." As the shock began to subside, a new reality set in. If Ricardo wasn't Pedro's biological father, then who was? And more importantly, where was their biological son? The possibility of a mistake at the hospital where Pedro was born suddenly loomed large in their minds. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The Silvas contacted the hospital where Pedro was born, demanding answers. An investigation was launched, records were scrutinized, and slowly, a picture began to emerge. It appeared that on the night Pedro was born, another boy had also come into the world, a child who, by all accounts, should have been the Silva's son. The other family, the Sousas, were located and contacted. They too were stunned by the revelation. For 8 years, they had raised a child they believed to be their own, never suspecting that a simple clerical error had altered the course of 2 families' lives. As the legal proceedings began, the emotional toll on both families became evident. The Silvas found themselves torn between their love for Pedro and their desire to know their biological child. The Sousas faced a similar dilemma. Both families struggled with questions of nature versus nurture, the true meaning of parenthood, and the unbreakable bonds formed over years of love and care. Meanwhile, Pedro's condition continued to deteriorate. The search for a compatible bone marrow donor took on a new urgency. In a twist of fate, it was discovered that Carlos Souza, the man who had unknowingly raised the Silva's biological son, was a perfect match for Pedro. The revelation brought a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, it offered hope for Pedro's recovery. On the other, it served as a painful reminder of the mix-up that had occurred 8 years ago. Carlos, to his credit, did not hesitate to offer his bone marrow. Regardless of biology, he said, these children are innocent in all this. If I can help, I will. As the families navigated the complexities of their new reality, they found unexpected support in each other. The Silvas and Sousas began to forge a unique bond, united by their shared experience and their love for the children they had raised. They attended counseling sessions together, worked through their feelings of anger and betrayal, and slowly began to envision a future where both families could coexist. The day of Pedro's transplant with Carlos's bone marrow arrived. The hospital waiting room was filled with members of both families, all anxiously awaiting news. Hours passed, marked only by the steady ticking of the clock and the occasional hushed conversation. Finally, Dr. Oliveira emerged, a smile breaking across her tired face. The transplant was successful, she announced. Pedro is responding well. A collective sigh of relief filled the room, followed by tears of joy and embraces. In that moment, the boundaries between the two families seemed to blur. They were no longer the Silvas and the Sousas, but simply a group of people united in their love for two young boys. As Pedro recovered, the families began the delicate process of introducing the boys to their biological parents. It was decided that for the time being, the children would remain with the families that had raised them, but with frequent visits and an open, honest dialogue about their unique situation. The journey ahead was not easy. There were legal hurdles to overcome, emotional wounds to heal, and a new family dynamic to navigate. But through it all, both families found strength in their shared experience and their unwavering commitment to the well-being of the children. Ricardo, who had once felt his world shattered by the revelation that Pedro was not his biological son, found that his love for the boy had only grown stronger through this ordeal. He realized that being a father was about more than genetics. It was about the countless bedtime stories, the scraped knees he had bandaged, the proud moments he had witnessed. Pedro was his son in every way that truly mattered. As months turned into years, the two families found a new normal. Holidays became grand affairs, with both sets of parents and children coming together to celebrate. The boys, now aware of their unique story, formed a bond that was part brotherhood, part friendship. They found strength in their shared experience, supporting each other through the challenges of growing up with such an unusual family dynamic. The hospital mix-up, which had once seemed like a cruel trick of fate, had in the end created something beautiful, an extended family bound not by blood, but by choice and love. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of unconditional love. As Pedro celebrated his 18th birthday, now healthy and thriving, he looked around at the gathering of people who had shaped his life, his parents who had raised him, his biological parents who had become dear friends, and the boy who was both his brother and his lifesaver. In that moment, surrounded by so much love, Pedro realized that family was not defined by DNA, but by the connections we forge and the love we choose to give. The story of the Silva and Souza families became a beacon of hope for others facing similar situations. It showed that even in the face of unimaginable challenges, love, compassion, and understanding could prevail. Their journey was a powerful reminder that family is not just about who we are born to, but about the people who stand by us, support us, and love us unconditionally through all of life's twists and turns. In the quiet suburbs of a bustling city, two families lived parallel lives, unaware of the profound connection that would soon unravel their carefully constructed realities. Ricardo and Mariana had always dreamed of becoming parents, and when they welcomed Pedro into their lives, they believed their family was complete. Across town, Carlos and Andrea experienced the same joy when Gustavo came into their world, filling their home with laughter and love. For years, these two families navigated the challenges and joys of parenthood, building memories and nurturing their children with unwavering devotion. As Pedro and Gustavo grew into curious and vibrant teenagers, their parents marveled at how quickly time had passed. Ricardo and Mariana watched with pride as Pedro excelled in his studies, showing a particular aptitude for science that neither of them possessed. They attributed his intelligence to a combination of good genes and their dedicated parenting. Meanwhile, Carlos and Andrea cheered Gustavo on at every soccer match, convinced that his athletic prowess was inherited from Carlos's side of the family. Life seemed to be unfolding as it should until a series of unexpected events began to chip away at the foundations of both families. It started with a routine medical checkup for Pedro, where a doctor noticed some genetic markers that didn't quite align with his parents' medical histories. The physician, initially puzzled, requested further tests, assuring Ricardo and Mariana that it was likely nothing to worry about. However, as the results came in, the doctor's face grew somber, and he asked to speak with the couple privately. In a sterile hospital room, Ricardo and Mariana's world shattered as they learned the truth. Pedro was not their biological son. The news hit them like a tidal wave, washing away years of certainty and leaving them adrift in a sea of questions. How could this have happened? Was there a mix-up at the hospital? Who were Pedro's real parents? And most importantly, how would this affect their beloved son? As Ricardo and Mariana grappled with this earth-shattering revelation across town, Carlos and Andrea remained blissfully unaware of the similar truth that lay dormant in their own family. Gustavo continued to thrive, his infectious laughter filling their home, while a secret lurked beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The journey to uncover the truth about Pedro's origins led Ricardo and Mariana down a complex path of legal inquiries, DNA tests, and emotional turmoil. They struggled with whether to tell Pedro, fearing that the news would devastate him and potentially damage the strong bond they had built over the years. Every time they looked at their son, they saw the same boy they had always loved, yet now there was an added layer of complexity to their relationship. As news of the mix-up began to circulate within the hospital administration, a thorough investigation was launched. Records were scrutinized, and staff members were interviewed, all in an attempt to understand how such a critical error could have occurred. It was during this process that the connection between the two families began to emerge. A diligent hospital administrator, piecing together the puzzle, realized that on the night Pedro and Gustavo were born, there had been a power outage that caused temporary chaos in the maternity ward. In the confusion that ensued, it appeared that the two newborn boys had been inadvertently switched. The discovery sent shockwaves through the hospital and set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter the lives of both families. Carlos and Andrea were summoned to the hospital, unaware of the life-changing news they were about to receive. as they sat in the same room where Ricardo and Mariana had learned the truth weeks earlier. They listened in disbelief as the hospital director explained the situation. Their world, too, began to crumble as they realized that Gustavo, the son they had raised and cherished for 15 years, was not biologically theirs. The revelation created a maelstrom of emotions for both sets of parents. They experienced grief for the biological children they had never known, guilt for the unintentional deception they had perpetrated, and fear for the impact this news would have on their sons. Yet, amidst the turmoil, there was also an undercurrent of love, a fierce, protective love for the children they had raised, regardless of biology. As the legal and emotional implications of the situation unfolded, the two families were brought together by circumstances they could never have imagined. Their first meeting was fraught with tension and awkwardness. Ricardo and Mariana found themselves face to face with the couple who had raised their biological son, while Carlos and Andrea struggled to reconcile the image of the baby they had taken home from the hospital, with the teenage boy now standing before them. Pedro and Gustavo, initially kept in the dark about the situation, sensed that something significant was happening. The hushed conversations, the sudden meetings with strangers, and the palpable tension in their homes did not go unnoticed. When the time came to tell them the truth, both sets of parents decided to do so together, presenting a united front in the face of this unprecedented challenge. The boys' reactions were as complex as the situation itself. Pedro, always analytical, tried to process the information logically, peppering his parents, both sets, with questions about genetics and legal rights. Gustavo, more emotionally driven, cycled through anger, confusion, and a deep sense of loss. Both boys struggled with their sense of identity, suddenly questioning everything they thought they knew about themselves and their families. In the weeks and months that followed, the two families embarked on an emotional journey of discovery and redefinition. They attended counseling sessions, both individually and as a group, working through the complex emotions that arose from their unique situation. Slowly, they began to forge new relationships, expanding their definition of family to include one another. Ricardo and Mariana found themselves developing a tentative friendship with Gustavo, recognizing in him echoes of themselves. They marveled at his athletic abilities, wondering if those traits had skipped a generation in their own families. Carlos and Andrea, in turn, began to see Pedro through new eyes, noticing similarities in mannerisms and interests that they had previously overlooked. As for Pedro and Gustavo, their relationship evolved in unexpected ways. Initially wary of each other, they gradually discovered a unique bond, one forged by their shared experience and the biological connection they now knew they had. They found themselves comparing notes on their childhoods, sharing stories about the parents who had raised them, and slowly building a brotherhood that transcended their unusual circumstances. The journey was far from easy. There were moments of resentment, when one boy would wonder what life might have been like if he had been raised by his biological parents. There were awkward family gatherings where everyone struggled to find their place in this new, expanded family dynamic. And there were legal and practical matters to address, such as potential changes to birth certificates and the question of whether the boys would split their time between households. Yet, as time passed, a new normal began to emerge. The boundaries of family expanded, creating a unique support system that encompassed all 6 individuals. Holidays became larger, more boisterous affairs, with 2 sets of grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins coming together to celebrate. School events and sports matches now had double the cheering section, with both families showing up to support both boys. Through it all, the love that had been cultivated over 15 years remained steadfast. Ricardo and Mariana's bond with Pedro didn't diminish with the knowledge that he wasn't biologically theirs. If anything, it grew stronger as they consciously chose to reaffirm their commitment to him. The same was true for Carlos and Andrea's relationship with Gustavo. Biology, they all came to realize, was just one facet of parenthood. As the boys approached adulthood, they carried with them a unique perspective on family and identity. They had learned firsthand that love isn't confined to genetic ties, that family can be both born and chosen, and that the human heart has a remarkable capacity to expand and embrace unexpected connections. The story of these two families serves as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of love. It challenges our preconceptions about the nature of family and reminds us that in the face of life's most unexpected twists, it is our choices and our capacity for love that truly define us. Ricardo, Mariana, Carlos, Andrea, Pedro, and Gustavo, 6 individuals brought together by chance, bound together by choice, forever changing the meaning of family in their intertwined lives. The weight of a decades-old secret bore heavily on Sofia's shoulders as she sat across from her grandson, Lucas, in the dimly lit living room of her modest apartment. The ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner seemed to grow louder with each passing moment, a constant reminder of the time that had slipped away, carrying with it the truth she had kept hidden for so long. Sofia's wrinkled hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together, her eyes searching Lucas's face for any sign of judgment or disappointment. But the young lawyer's expression remained neutral, his training in maintaining composure serving him well in this unexpected family meeting. Sofia took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confession that was about to spill from her lips. She had carried this burden for over 3 decades, a secret that had gnawed at her conscience and robbed her of countless nights of peaceful sleep. Now, at the age of 78, she felt an overwhelming need to unburden herself, to seek redemption before it was too late. Lucas leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, sensing the gravity of what his grandmother was about to share. With a voice that quivered with emotion, Sofia began her tale. She spoke of her early days as a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, a time filled with hope and a genuine desire to make a difference in people's lives. The hospital had been her second home, a place where she had witnessed countless miracles and heartbreaks. But it was also the place where she had made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. It had happened on a particularly chaotic night in the maternity ward. 2 women had given birth within minutes of each other, their cries of pain and joy echoing through the corridors. One was a wealthy socialite, married to a prominent businessman, while the other was a struggling single mother working multiple jobs to make ends meet. In the rush and confusion of the moment, Sofia had made a mistake that she quickly realized but, in a moment of weakness and misguided compassion, chose not to correct. The babies had been switched. Sofia's voice grew hoarse as she recounted the events of that fateful night. She described the panic that had gripped her when she realized her error, the internal struggle as she contemplated the consequences of her actions. In that moment, clouded by exhaustion and a misplaced sense of justice, she had convinced herself that the switch could be a blessing in disguise. The wealthy couple would provide a life of opportunity and privilege for the child of the struggling mother, while the other baby would receive the unconditional love and attention of a mother who had longed for a child of her own. Lucas listened intently, his legal mind already racing with the implications of his grandmother's confession. He could see the pain etched on Sophia's face, the years of guilt manifesting in the deep lines around her eyes and mouth. As she continued her story, Sophia spoke of the years that followed, how she had watched from afar as the two families raised children that were not biologically theirs. She had seen the switched babies grow into adults, their lives taking paths that seemed to validate her decision in some twisted way. The wealthy couple's daughter had indeed been given every opportunity, excelling in school and eventually becoming a successful surgeon. The other child, raised by the single mother, had grown into a compassionate social worker, dedicating his life to helping underprivileged families. Sophia's voice cracked as she admitted that she had used these outcomes to justify her actions to herself, even as the guilt continued to eat away at her. But now, as she approached the twilight of her life, Sophia could no longer bear the weight of her secret. She turned to Lucas, her eyes pleading for understanding and help. She wanted to make things right, to give the now adult children and their families the truth they deserved. But she was terrified of the consequences, of the pain and confusion her revelation would cause. Lucas sat back, running a hand through his hair as he processed the enormity of what his grandmother had just shared. His legal training kicked in, and he began to consider the various ramifications of the situation. There were questions of ethics, legality, and morality swirling in his mind. He thought about the statute of limitations, the potential lawsuits, the media frenzy that could ensue if this story became public. But beyond the legal considerations, Lucas was grappling with his own emotional response to the revelation. This was his grandmother, the woman who had baked him cookies and tended to his scraped knees throughout his childhood. He had always seen her as a paragon of virtue, a caring and dedicated nurse who had touched countless lives. Now, he was forced to reconcile that image with the reality of her monumental mistake and the subsequent cover-up. Sophia watched her grandson anxiously, trying to gauge his reaction. She had chosen to confide in Lucas not just because of his legal expertise, but because of the strong bond they shared. She hoped that he would understand the complex emotions that had led to her decision all those years ago, even if he couldn't condone her actions. After what seemed like an eternity, Lucas broke the silence. He spoke softly, asking Sophia for more details about the families involved. He wanted to know if she had any documentation, any proof of the switch beyond her own recollection. Sophia shook her head, explaining that she had been too afraid to keep any evidence that might incriminate her. All she had were her memories and the names of the families, which she had guarded closely all these years. As the night wore on, grandmother and grandson talked through the various options before them. Lucas explained the legal and ethical obligations they faced, the potential consequences of revealing the truth after so many years. He spoke of the emotional trauma it could cause to all parties involved, the questions of identity and belonging that would inevitably arise. Sophia listened intently, her heart heavy with the realization of the far-reaching impact of her past actions. She had known that confessing would be difficult, but sitting there with Lucas, she began to truly understand the complexity of the situation she had created. The lives of two entire families hung in the balance, their foundations about to be shaken by a truth that had been buried for over 3 decades. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, Lucas and Sophia came to a decision. They would approach the situation carefully, methodically. Lucas would discreetly gather more information about the families involved, assessing their current situations and potential receptiveness to the truth. Sophia would write detailed accounts of everything she remembered from that night and the years that followed, creating a record that could be used if and when they decided to move forward with the revelation. They agreed that the ultimate goal would be to disclose the truth, but in a way that would minimize the pain and disruption to all involved. It would be a delicate balance, one that would require all of Lucas's legal acumen and Sophia's intimate knowledge of the situation. As Sophia walked Lucas to the door, she felt a mix of emotions: relief at having finally shared her burden, anxiety about the path ahead, and a glimmer of hope that perhaps, after all these years, she might find a way to make amends for her fateful decision. Lucas hugged his grandmother tightly before leaving, reassuring her that they would face this challenge together. As he stepped out into the early morning light, he couldn't help but reflect on the unpredictable nature of life and the profound impact that a single moment, a single decision, could have on so many lives. The secret of the nurse was no longer confined to Sophia's conscience. Now, it was a shared responsibility, a truth waiting to be unveiled, with the power to rewrite the stories of two families and challenge the very notion of what it means to be family. As Lucas drove home, he steeled himself for the complex journey ahead, knowing that the road to resolution would be long and fraught with emotional and ethical challenges. But he was determined to help his grandmother find peace and, in doing so, bring truth and closure to all those affected by a long-ago night in a busy hospital ward. The sterile corridors of St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with an unusual tension that afternoon. Nurses hurried past with clipboards clutched to their chests, stealing glances at the gathering crowd in the waiting area. It wasn't often that family drama unfolded so publicly in these halls, but today was different. Today, secrets long buried were about to surface, and lives would inevitably change. The Almeida and Santos families sat on opposite sides of the room, an invisible line dividing them like opposing teams before a match. The air was thick with anticipation and unspoken accusations. Maria Almeida, her face etched with worry lines, kept wringing her hands in her lap, occasionally glancing at her husband, João, who stood stoically by the window, his gaze fixed on the parking lot below. Across from them, Clara Santos perched on the edge of her seat, her perfectly manicured nails tapping an irregular rhythm on her designer handbag. Her husband, Antonio, paced back and forth, his expensive shoes clicking against the linoleum floor with each step. Between these two family units sat Ricardo, the eye of this emotional storm, his presence both the catalyst and the potential bomb for the impending revelation. The tension had been building for weeks, ever since a routine medical test had uncovered a startling possibility. Now, as they all waited for the final results, the weight of 2 decades of secrets and lies pressed down upon them. The truth, whatever it might be, threatened to unravel the fabric of both families. A door opened, and Dr. Oliveira emerged, his face a mask of professional neutrality. All eyes turned to him, breaths held in collective anticipation. "I have the results," he announced, his voice steady but tinged with the gravity of the moment. "Perhaps we should move to a more private dash. Just tell us," Antonio interrupted, his voice sharp with impatience. "We've waited long enough." Dr. Oliveira nodded, understanding the urgency. "Very well," he said, taking a deep breath. "The DNA test confirms that Ricardo is indeed the biological son of João and Maria Almeida." The words hung in the air for a moment before chaos erupted. Clara let out a strangled cry, tears immediately springing to her eyes. Antonio's face contorted with rage, his fists clenching at his sides. Across the room, Maria collapsed into silent sobs, while João remained frozen, his expression unreadable. Ricardo, caught in the middle, felt the weight of 2 decades of lies crashing down upon him. He had always felt different, out of place in the Santos household, but never had he imagined this. His mind raced through memories, recontextualizing every moment of his life through this new lens. "How could you?" Antonio roared, rounding on João. "He was my son. I raised him." João finally broke his silence, his voice low and filled with regret. "It wasn't like that, Antonio. We never meant to dash, never meant to what?" Clara interjected, her voice trembling with anger and hurt. "Never meant to lie to us for 20 years? Never meant to steal a child?" The accusations flew back and forth, years of buried resentments and suspicions bubbling to the surface. Nurses and other patients in the vicinity watched wide-eyed as the family drama unfolded before them. It was Ricardo who finally cut through the noise. "Stop," he shouted, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent corridor. All eyes turned to him, seeing not the confused child they had known, but a man standing at a crossroads. "This isn't helping anyone," he continued, his voice steadier now. "What's done is done. We can't change the past, but we can decide how we move forward." His words seemed to deflate some of the anger in the room, replacing it with a heavy sadness. Clara reached out to him, her hand trembling. "Ricardo, meu filho," she whispered, "you'll always be my son, no matter what any test says." Ricardo took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I know, May," he said softly. "And you'll always be my mother. But," he paused, looking over at Maria and João, "I need to know where I came from too." The simplicity of his statement cut through the complexity of the situation. For a moment, everyone was reminded of the innocent child caught in the middle of this adult deception. João stepped forward, his eyes meeting Ricardo's for what felt like the first time. "We never meant to hurt anyone," he said, his voice thick with emotion. We thought we were doing what was best." "Best for whom?" Antonio spat, but his anger seemed to have lost some of its heat. Ricardo turned to face Antonio and Clara, the only parents he had known for 20 years. "I need to understand," he said. "I need to know how this happened, why it happened. And I think I need to get to know João and Maria." His words hung in the air, a proposal that seemed both impossible and inevitable. Clara's grip on his hand tightened, a silent plea not to leave her. Antonio's face was a mask of hurt and betrayal. "I'm not choosing between you," Ricardo clarified, sensing their fears. "I'm choosing to embrace the truth, however complicated it might be. I have 2 sets of parents now, and I want to know them both." It was a decision that no one had anticipated, least of all Ricardo himself. But as he stood there, in the middle of the hospital waiting room, he felt a strange sense of rightness. The truth, painful as it was, offered a chance for healing, for understanding. Dr. Oliveira, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mixture of professional detachment and human sympathy, stepped forward. "Perhaps," he suggested gently, "it would be beneficial for all of you to speak with a family counselor. This is a complex situation, and professional guidance could help navigate the emotional challenges ahead." Ricardo nodded, grateful for the suggestion. "I think that's a good idea," he said, looking around at the faces of his family, both families. "We have a lot to work through, and it won't be easy. But I believe we can do it together." His words seemed to release some of the tension in the room. Slowly, hesitantly, the 2 families began to move closer together. There were no hugs, no sudden reconciliations, the wounds were too fresh, the shock too new. But there was a sense of possibility, a tiny spark of hope amidst the pain and confusion. As they left the hospital that day, walking out into the warm afternoon sun, nothing was resolved. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with difficult conversations and painful truths yet to be uncovered. But Ricardo's decision had opened a door, offering a path forward through the tangled web of lies and love that bound them all together. For Ricardo, it was the first step on a journey of self-discovery, a chance to reconcile the person he thought he was with the truth of his origins. For the Almeidas and the Santos, it was an opportunity to confront the past and perhaps, in time, find forgiveness. As they dispersed to their separate cars, each lost in their own thoughts, there was a shared understanding that life would never be the same. But with that understanding came a glimmer of hope, hope that from the ashes of their old lives, something new and meaningful could emerge. The truth had finally come to light, and now, together, they would learn to live in its glow. In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Oakwood, where picket fences lined neatly trimmed lawns and the scent of jasmine wafted through the air, the intertwined lives of two families were about to undergo a profound transformation. The Silvas and the Ferreiras had been neighbors for years, their children growing up side by side, sharing birthday parties, and creating memories that would last a lifetime. Little did they know that their bonds would soon be tested and ultimately strengthened in ways they never imagined. It all began on a warm summer evening when Ricardo Silva, a successful architect with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, received a phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman he hadn't spoken to in over 2 decades, his college sweetheart Maria. Her words came in a rush, filled with a mix of regret and hope, as she revealed a secret she had kept hidden for far too long. Pedro, the boy Ricardo had always assumed was his best friend's son, was actually his own flesh and blood. The revelation hit Ricardo like a thunderbolt, his mind reeling with questions and emotions he couldn't begin to process. As he sat in his study, the family photos on the wall seemed to stare back at him accusingly, reminding him of the life he had built with his wife Ana and their son Gustavo. How could he possibly integrate this newfound knowledge into the fabric of their existence? Across the street, in the Ferreira household, Pedro was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. He sat at the kitchen table, laughing with his parents, João and Clara, and his younger sister Beatriz. The aroma of his mother's famous feijoada filled the air, a comforting reminder of the love and warmth that had always surrounded him. Yet, even as he joked with his family, Pedro couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, a piece of himself he couldn't quite identify. In the days that followed, the weight of the secret pressed heavily on Ricardo's shoulders. He found himself watching Pedro from afar, noticing for the first time the similarities in their mannerisms. The way they both furrowed their brows when deep in thought, the infectious laughter that could light up a room. The more he observed, the more his heart ached with a mixture of love and longing for the son he had never known. Ana, ever perceptive, sensed the change in her husband. She watched as he grew distant, his eyes often glazing over during conversations, his mind clearly elsewhere. It wasn't until one sleepless night, as they lay side by side in the darkness, that Ricardo finally found the courage to share the truth. Ana's initial shock gave way to a deep well of compassion, her love for Ricardo allowing her to see beyond the pain of his past indiscretion to the man she had built a life with. Together, they grappled with the implications of this revelation, their whispered conversations lasting long into the night as they tried to navigate the complex emotions and ethical dilemmas they now faced. Across the street, Clara Ferreira had begun to notice subtle changes in her son. Pedro, always a thoughtful and introspective young man, seemed to be withdrawing into himself more than usual. she caught him staring out the window at the Silva house with an unreadable expression, and when she asked him about it, he simply shrugged and changed the subject. Clara's maternal instincts told her that something was amiss, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it might be. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in both households continued to build. Ricardo struggled with the decision of whether to reveal the truth to Pedro, torn between his desire to know his son and the fear of disrupting the life Pedro had always known. Ana wrestled with her own conflicting emotions, her love for her husband at odds with the hurt and betrayal she felt. And through it all, Gustavo remained oblivious, his carefree teenage world untouched by the turmoil surrounding him. It was Gustavo who unknowingly set in motion the events that would bring everything to a head. One lazy Sunday afternoon, he invited Pedro over to play video games, as he had done countless times before. As the two boys sat side by side on the couch, their laughter echoing through the house, Ricardo found himself unable to tear his gaze away from them. The sight of his two sons, one known and one hidden, together under his roof was almost more than he could bear. In that moment, overcome by emotion, Ricardo made a decision that would alter the course of all their lives. With trembling hands, he called both families together, gathering them in his living room under the pretense of a neighborly get-together. As they all sat there, confused by the somber atmosphere, Ricardo took a deep breath and began to speak. His words came haltingly at first, but gained strength as he poured out the truth that had been consuming him. The room fell into a shocked silence as he finished, the weight of his confession hanging heavy in the air. What followed was a whirlwind of emotions. Pedro, his world turned upside down, stormed out of the house, needing space to process the earth-shattering news. João Ferreira, feeling betrayed by both his wife and his friend, retreated into a stony silence. Clara, tears streaming down her face, reached out to comfort Pedro, only to have him pull away for the first time in his life. Gustavo, struggling to comprehend that the boy he had grown up with was actually his brother, alternated between anger at his father's deception and a strange sense of excitement at the prospect of having a sibling. In the chaos that ensued, it was Ana who emerged as the calm at the center of the storm. With a grace that surprised even herself, she became the mediator, the voice of reason in a situation that threatened to tear apart two families. She spoke to each person individually, offering comfort, understanding, and a perspective that allowed them to see beyond their immediate pain to the larger picture of family and love. Over the following months, both families embarked on a journey of healing and redefinition. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when it seemed that the fractures between them would never mend. But slowly, with patience and compassion, they began to forge a new kind of family bond. Ricardo, determined to make up for lost time, reached out to Pedro, offering not to replace João as his father, but to be an additional source of love and support in his life. Pedro, after initial resistance, found himself drawn to the man who shared his DNA, curious about the parts of himself that might be explained by this newfound connection. João, though deeply hurt, came to understand that love was not a finite resource, and that Pedro's connection to Ricardo didn't diminish the bond they had shared for the past 18 years. Clara, relieved to have the burden of her secret lifted, worked tirelessly to rebuild trust with both her husband and her son. And through it all, Ana stood as a pillar of strength, her unwavering love for Ricardo and her acceptance of Pedro setting an example for everyone involved. As the dust began to settle, the two households found themselves drawing closer together rather than further apart. Family dinners became a regular occurrence, with both families gathering around a large table, sharing food, laughter, and the occasional tear as they navigated their new reality. Gustavo and Pedro, their bond strengthened by the revelation of their true relationship, became inseparable, their brotherly love transcending the circumstances of their connection. In time, the initial shock and pain gave way to a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to be a family. They realized that family wasn't defined by blood alone, but by the choices they made every day to love and support one another. The extended family they had become was not bound by traditional definitions, but by the threads of compassion, forgiveness, and unconditional love that they had woven together through their shared experience. As the sun set on another family gathering, Ricardo looked around at the faces of those he loved: Ana, Gustavo, Pedro, João, Clara, and Beatriz. He marveled at the journey they had undertaken, the obstacles they had overcome, and the love that had ultimately prevailed. In that moment, he understood that family was not about perfection or adhering to societal norms. It was about acceptance, growth, and the willingness to open one's heart to new possibilities. The true meaning of family, he realized, lay not in the circumstances of one's birth, but in the conscious decision to stand by one another, to forgive, to love, and to create a tapestry of relationships that could weather any storm. As laughter filled the air and the aroma of a shared meal wafted from the kitchen, Ricardo knew that they had not just maintained their current arrangements, they had transcended them, creating something beautiful and enduring in the process. The extended family they had become was a testament to the resilience of the human heart and the boundless capacity for love that resided within each of them.